We would like to remind you this week about something called subordinating conjunctions in English. So conjunctions are generally words that link ideas in sentences. There is a rainbow here with lots of different subordinating conjunctions on. We've got if, since, as, when, although, while, after, before, until, and because. These are not the only ones, but they're probably the ones that we would use the most. With sentences, most sentences make sense if they have a main clause. So this purple sentence here, I wouldn't have trapped the Iron Man. It stands alone, it makes sense on its own, and we call that the main clause. If we're adding detail to that sentence, we would add that through a subordinate clause, and those start with a subordinating conjunction, like the ones at the top. Sometimes those might go at the beginning like this, so our sentence might sound like this. If I could go back in time, I wouldn't have trapped the Iron Man. It starts with a subordinating conjunction, which is if. But that yellow part, that subordinate clause, doesn't make sense on its own. If it just said, if I could go back in time, we would be wondering what's the next part. But the purple part does make sense on its own. The other part is the extra part. It could be that we swap those round and they go the other way. When we do put that yellow subordinate clause at the beginning, we would try and separate it from the main clause using a comma, like you can see. This is very similar. We've got the main clause, I felt so guilty. It does make sense on its own, but we can add detail through a subordinate clause which starts with one of those conjunctions. This one starts with when. When I saw him lying in the pit, comma, I felt so guilty. The comma is used to separate the main clause and the subordinate clause, but it starts the sentence with a subordinating conjunction. Here's another example. This is the main clause in purple. I stood and stared at the giant pit. Our subordinate clause, to add a bit more detail, is while the farmers cheered, comma, I stood and stared at the giant pit. These are all linked to the story of the Iron Man. I've chosen those colours because our jumpers are purple in our school, and so they're the most important part, and then we've got a little bit of yellow, which is the extra bit that adds the detail. So this is the same with sentences. The purple part is our main clause that makes sense on its own, and the yellow part adds that bit of detail, and that's when we use those subordinating conjunctions. In maths, we're going to be reminded about angles today. So an angle is made when two straight lines meet. So there's some examples there of straight lines coming together and meeting, and an angle is what is created at that point. Sometimes we talk about turns as angles. So you can see the turtle moving here. You've got clockwise turning, which is moving in the direction of the clock, and anti-clockwise turning, which is moving in the opposite direction of a clock. When we turn 90 degrees or 1/4 turn, it's turning something called one right angle. A half turn means we're basically turning around and facing the other way. 3/4 turns means we're doing 3 of those quarter turns. If you can count them, that's easier. And if we do 4 of those quarter turns, we have done a whole turn. And those are what we call, this is how we measure them in angles. We say it's 90 degrees for a quarter turn, 180 for a half, 270 for a 3/4, and a 360 degrees for a whole turn clockwise. And it's the same for anti-clockwise. So if you were giving someone directions, you could use some of these to help you give very accurate directions. Another time we talk about right angles is when two lines meet, like this in the first picture. We've got two lines meeting, one horizontal, one vertical line, and they're meeting at a very particular sized point. it creates that little square in the corner. So right angles are very special because they meet in this exact position. The size of a right angle is 90 degrees. A quarter turn looks like this. The man is facing the front. If he then turns 1/4 turn clockwise, that's where he'll be turning. This line shows how he would have turned a half turn, and this line shows where he would be if he turned 3/4 of a turn. Here are some shapes with the right angles labelled in them. You can see that the square and the rectangle have a right angle in each of their corners. You can see that there's a shape that it's been like a square but been turned on its side a little bit like a diamond, and even though it doesn't look exactly like the square, if you move your paper around or move your face around, you can see there are actually 4 right angles in those corners. I wonder if you can see any in the other shapes, or whether you think by looking that those don't have right angles. Maybe you can go on a little right angle hunt at your house and see if you can find any. I'm sure there's lots of them to be found.